Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Check the Map. I'm Tyler Bannister, joined by Kirsten Crum and Nick Wages of SRG Financial Advisors. We're about to complete the eighth month of 2025, and the second half of August, the middle of August, has proved to be a pretty interesting time just in the last 2 weeks. We're going to dive into what's driving some of this, but as far as market activity, when you look at August 8th through August 22nd, that 2 week period, um, there was no straight line involved for sure as far as market movement. But when you look at broad U.S. equity indices, stock indices, um, nearly all of them, not all of them, but nearly all of them were positive over that 2 week period. We had the Dow up 3.3%. We had S&P up 1.2. Russell 1000, 1.35% up over 2 weeks. The Russell 3000, 1.56. What I want to point out, bonds were pretty well flat. Gold was actually down a little bit. The big winner in major US stock indices, any guesses what the big winner was in that 2 week period, that volatile 2 week period?
Small caps finally got some.
You
Small cap.
got it. You got it, right? The Russell 2000 US small caps just in that 2 week period up 6.47%. So almost double what the Dow did. We've got over 5 times what the S&P did just in that time frame. Um, and what do you think might have helped spur that on over those past 2 weeks?
I was just getting ready to say, like, we'll talk about that, but if you would have said those results prior to Friday, the S&P 500 during that 2 week period would have actually been down slightly.
Yes, if we had recorded this on Friday, August 22nd, and said how have the last 10, 11 days been, we'd see multiple negative numbers, right? So it was a challenging couple weeks overall until Friday. And Kirsten, do you want to, what was the big news? And by big, I
The
mean
big news.
like 1,000 word essay. What was that essay that
So
led the
let me
markets
get
to
my,
jump?
my magnifying glass out because you really got to thumb through all the words Jerome Powell says, and it comes down to this is really it. It was a shifting balance of risks that may warrant adjusting our policy stance. And just as simple as that, you can make the market move. I don't know.
Shifting balance. So it's not really like fully balanced. It's a shifting balance, and it may
May.
warrant.
It may shift the balance, correct? So
Yeah.
of course that was the widely interpretation of now we might get a rate cut,
Here's
which
the question. Does he write that himself? Does he have a staffer write it? Or is this a use of AI saying, what is the most middle of the road way I can say that we're considering raising or cutting interest rates at some point? I wonder
how
what
do I
his
subtly
method
tell them without saying it out loud?
without committing to anything at all.
Makes virtually no sense. Our last check the map, we talked about the CPI data that was fresh off the presses right as we were recording, which annualized was up 2.7. The producer price index came out 2 days later with annualized price increases of 3.3%. So inflation hasn't massively improved to adjust the stance, but
No.
somebody's elbow got to the rib cage enough to.
Well, and it didn't even come out during like FOMC minutes was last Wednesday when that came out about
Yeah,
CPI, and it wasn't then. It was nope, let's Friday, let's get him on a stage and have him say something real quick.
right. Let's put all that spotlight and pressure and see if we can get one glimmer of rate cut hinting. And it did come. And it resulted in a pretty big uptick in U.S. equity markets on Friday, no doubt. The and obviously we talked about this before. The benefit to small caps is that if it's a smaller corporation and their cost of debt, their debt service expense for money they're borrowing to grow their company, they don't get as favorable terms as your Fortune 500 companies, just by virtue of size and how much they're borrowing. So a shift in interest rates affects the bottom line for those smaller companies a lot faster than it does the larger corporations. So when we see a potential rate cut, they're saying, oh, we might get to reduce our debt expense and therefore increasing our bottom line and profitability. And so you see that larger uptick on the small cap side. What I think is pretty interesting, let me share this historical chart of the Fed funds rate. Uh, can you guys see that okay?
Yeah.
So this goes back essentially the last 70 years or so. And where we're at right now in the 4.33% range as of July. So this is through July of this year. You look at this historical chart and markets are clamoring for rate cuts. And if you listen to um, even some economists, but definitely pundits that talk about the real economy and stock markets, et cetera, there's a clamoring for multiple rate cuts. This wishful longing, essentially. And you look at this historical average and you go, man, we're kind of right in line with where rates have been for most of 50 years when you really cut this in half. If we take this high point in the early 80s, we're over 19%. So if you take what's half of that, we got what 9.5% interest, and we're right now we're at a less than of 25% of the highest point from the last 50 years. And I think, Nick, I think you had alluded to this off camera, but really this recency bias is what's causing this desire for further rate cuts. We saw unnaturally low interest rates for so long after the Great Recession. We got so accustomed to essentially free money that having some sort of interest rate tied to debt at this point, you build habits when you have this many years of quote unquote free money. And really during the pandemic, it went back down there. So we had this one blip that got us up to almost 2.5, but we're going from 2008 until 2022. It's a lot of time to get used to free money and cheap mortgages, et cetera, where you don't worry about home prices creeping up, right? Or you don't worry about carrying debt. And then all of a sudden, we had a pretty steep incline in interest rates. So when you take a step back from the feeling that people have right now, we're not in a terrible spot interest rate rise. So we'll see how markets react if they only cut once or if they delay the cut beyond September. It's just all speculation at this point, but
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head as far as the habits that are developed, like recency bias, along with that, decade plus of time where, you know, spending increases. We didn't really see a whole lot of inflation at that point. So, you know, it really wasn't that big of a deal to carry a credit balance like it is today, you know. Whereas now, what's most prominently impacted by these rates at the consumer level is this almost $1.2 trillion credit card revolving debt issue that we have in America. And when you think about that, that is actually directly tied to the rates between prime rate, federal funds rate, that influences the variable rates that people pay on credit card balances. And when we have a ballooned credit issue because of inflation and also because of interest rates being held slightly higher than what we're used to without other habits changing in conjunction with that, there's obviously a significant impact, not just to how much people have to pay in interest on their credit card balances, but how high their credit card balances go because of that higher interest that they're accruing and not paying off on a regular basis. Like if you pay your minimum payment, may not even be paying all the interest that accrued for that specific month. So yeah, there's real consequences at the consumer level for the rate adjustments, and people are sure crying out and looking for every headline that suggests that might happen in the near future.
yeah, I was trying to pull up a chart just looking at debt because if you, I'm not sure if I'm able to find it on the fly here. Well, what I was thinking though is the other part, historically speaking, when you look at that interest rate chart, let me pull it back up for just a second. Um, the accessibility of debt over in our society over these years, right? So, and I'm going to mess up these dates, but I believe it wasn't until sometime in the 80s where a woman in this country could get a credit card on her own, like legally, had to have a male cosigner. And also on small business loans. I believe it was also in the 80s, if not early 90s, when a woman could have access to credit for a business. My point is that's just one glimpse of how credit markets weren't as liquid or accessible to the broad U.S. population. And so when we had interest rates up here, higher in the 70s, multiple times. I mean, the lowest point it got in here in the 70s was down to 3.3% briefly. And then it went back up and stayed in the high fours or above five for almost that entire time. But when we had this elevated interest rate period, there wasn't as much credit card debt. There wasn't as much consumer debt out there. And so, yes, it impacted households. It made buying a house difficult, but it wasn't as pervasive as it is now. And we talk about these consumer debt totals. And my apologies for not being able to pull up the chart quickly, but um, our astronomical consumer debt and what that chart looks like now does not include, as we mentioned before, the buy now, pay later
Mhm.
options through companies like Klarna, et cetera, where it's essentially high interest debt that doesn't even get totaled up or aggregated into our country totals. Um, so again, historically, not a bad interest rate. Part of the thing is we got accustomed to the low part, the 0% interest essentially for so long, and and we've never had these levels of consumer debt to contend with. So
Yeah. If you look at the totals from the Fed Bank of New York in the first quarter, at the end of the first quarter of this year, our total household debt as a nation was $18.2 trillion, of which 12.8 trillion was mortgage balances. And then auto loans and credit cards are kind of in step with each other. Auto loans are 1.54 trillion, credit cards 1.18 trillion. It's crazy to think an auto loan is a secured loan. There's a piece of collateral tied to it, which does help the interest rate a little bit in comparison to credit cards. Um, but the fact that completely uncollateralized, unsecured credit cards, and some of them can be secured, right? Like with a bank account with a balance in it. But at the end of the day, revolving credit card balances that are not secured by a piece of collateral in most cases there's nearly as much of that outstanding as there is car loans in the US.
yeah,
So
yeah, certainly
big,
interesting, which
big
kind of
impact.
brings us along this interest rate and debt standpoint to the housing data. But you guys want to jump into the most recent housing reports that we've had over the past 2 weeks?
Yeah, I can start off with some housing permits. I can share my screen. Maybe I can. Yes, I can. Okay, awesome. You see this?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, so we had a few different reports that came out, obviously, in the past 2 weeks since the last time that we spoke. Here's one of them. This is for building permits. Of course, this is, projecting out forward looking as we're looking at building permits. We came in at $1.35 million or million housing permits, and this was about 5.7% below the July rate, and about 2.8% below from June, coming this time around. Um, so a little bit of softening. July permits came down just a little bit, and single home ones, let's see, where was that? Single home family was at 870, which came up just a little bit, which is a little bit of a plus because I know we've been tracking the single family homes as well as the multifamily homes and seeing a little bit of a bump in the permits for seeing single family homes, is a good place to start. So that was kind of as far as this report. Nick, I'm sure you have some things to add.
Yeah, it's interesting because most of the time when we get when the headline reading looks positive to the public, it's because builders have shifted to multifamily starts. Like multifamily starts in the last 12 months are up
Mhm.
24%. So they were up 9.9% for the month last year, compared to single family being up 2.8%. So a slight increase for single family, but this is an actually really interesting trend, and I think it follows the narrative of what we talked about, how not a tremendous amount of what we would consider to be starter homes or starter home prices being built and developed right now, which is an issue, substantial issue. Like we want to see more starts and permits. We want to see all those numbers going up uh, really significantly. But one thing that's really interesting is as that does not happen, is that the median price of new homes and the average price of new homes are both down 5% plus per year. So the median price of a new home in July was 4038, which is down 5.9% from a year ago. And this is crazy because everybody, most common analysis right now is if you wait another year to buy a house, you're probably going to pay more for a house, right? And then the average price of a new home. So looking at like the actual mean as opposed to the median, the average price of a new home was 487.3, which is also down 5% compared to a year ago. Contrast that to existing homes, which there is a starter home market for, have not experienced a decline in value. They've continued to appreciate. And while they did go down slightly in July, I think you got it right there, the 422.4. They're still up 0.2% versus a year ago. So in a 12-month period where we've been really strained by the affordability of houses, the number of houses that people are looking for and can afford, we see existing homes still going up incrementally in price. And the bigger issue too, obviously, and this probably points to the shift towards multifamily starts, is that even with good numbers from July as far as existing home sales go, we're still averaging about just over 4 million for the year, which is really 5.25 million was the pace that existed pre-COVID. So we're averaging 1.25 million units less sold on a year-over-year basis than we were prior to the pandemic. So there's an interesting trend, is that single family new home sales are actually going down in price, and there could potentially be less demand given that they aren't, starter homes. And then the existing home sales, while there isn't nearly enough supply to support that starter home market, that seems to be the biggest issue as far as people looking for houses right now, that they're still going up in price because of the fact that there's such a limited supply and such a high demand for them right now. So yeah, interesting numbers. Nothing that and from any of the reports that says, hey, we're gonna have this housing
Change of
affordability.
stance.
No change of stance.
Yeah, yeah. I also saw this increase in median existing home prices was also the 25th straight year-over-year increase that has continued to climb. So
Yeah.
yeah, pair that with everything else.
Yeah.
Change your
Well, and then
stance.
I mean, a huge headwind. We were talking about interest rates. A massive headwind in the existing home sales market, and this makes sense, is in the industry they kind of refer to it as a locked-in phenomenon, where even with all of the house price appreciation on existing homes, people that are considering selling to realize that price appreciation aren't just thinking to themselves, oh, but I'm also going to pay more on the next house. They're also thinking to themselves, oh, I got to sacrifice this 2.75% 30-year mortgage or 15-year mortgage rate that I took out 5 years ago and go get what today's average 30-year interest rate right now is around 6.7%. So
Yeah.
more than double the interest rate So if you sell right now to realize price appreciation, there's a pretty good chance that's almost entirely, if not more than entirely, getting offset by how much more you're going to pay for a new house and how much you're going to pay in interest on a new loan if you're borrowing to buy it.
Yeah, it's and the quote unquote American dream of the single family home and white picket fence
Mhm.
um obviously is a challenge. And then when you have more housing starts being multifamily instead of single family, there's there might have to be a shift in expectations. But when there's a cultural narrative that's ingrained, that's not easy to um, it's not easy to stray from that or adjust and go with another path. And people have that like that feeling of I need to get to that single family home. I need to find a starter home, and if it's just not there, there has to be that shift in expectations. And with sentiment was part of that. And let me share this. This is kind of interesting. The preliminary results for the consumer sentiment survey that the University of Michigan does. So this is when you hear consumer sentiment did this or that in the news, they're typically referring to this survey that's done on a monthly basis. We saw from July to August a 5% drop in consumer sentiment. And then the index of consumer expectations also dropped. And then the current economic conditions, the feelings towards that dropped over 10%, just month over month. And then you look year over year, you say, hey, where were we 12 months ago? And if you think about it, where we were 12 months ago, it was in the middle of a presidential campaign, election season. And and so it looks like, year over year, we've dropped almost 14% in consumer sentiment from this time in 2024, uh, with all of the balls that are being juggled from tariffs to interest rates, et cetera. It'll be interesting to see where does this go as we lead into the holiday season, which typically is for retail establishments needs to be a good time of year, right? That's when most of their revenue and ultimately net income is made. So we'll see how these consumer sentiment um, and expectations how they feed into the last quarter of 2025. But kind of interesting to see. I think Nick and you had mentioned this earlier as well. When you look at the categories in the CPI report, in the inflation, when you look at the granular categories on the items that really affect the typical household on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, those hadn't slowed down as much as the top line number, right? The cost of meat and food and even maintenance on vehicles, right? Especially as we're going into the winter season, which is typically, hey, make sure your vehicle is ready for winter. Do you have Are your tires good enough? For much of our country where do get snow and ice and bad weather, are your tires good enough? Is your oil changed? And that was one of the biggest increases year over year from inflation. So it's not shocking that we're seeing that sentiment go down a little bit, but in a time where our economy needs people to be spending money, this might be a little bit of a headwind for the fourth quarter.
Yeah. And you mentioned even buying seasons for different industries. The numbers we talked about for housing, we're basically coming out of what is typically
Mm,
the buying season. Usually people
good point.
settled in before school. So the fact that we're still significantly lagging historical norms is another concerning sign, but it's not surprising in any way, shape, or form when you look at, I mean, even if you like actually methodically plan out buying a new house and you look at the cost of insurance and property taxes and maintenance and how inflation impacts all of those things beyond just the price and the interest rate, there's a lot of financial considerations to take, whenever you're looking at buying a house. So when you factor all that, it's not surprising that the numbers are down, but it is a little bit alarming or concerning maybe that we're coming out of our what we consider the peak buying season at significant lags of historical norms. So
Right.
perhaps on perhaps the comments from Friday that maybe there needs to be a little bit of relief with regards to interest rate reductions. Uh,
May. Cannot say may or may not, but may.
yeah, Yeah, not going to commit themselves to anything, that's for sure.
I was looking, I think the probability for rate cut this next month went from like 60, 70% to like 85, 86% now. Um, so we'll see. We'll see if that shows.
Yep.
We ready to look at calendar for the coming
Yeah.
month,
What
coming
do we
Monday?
have in the next couple of weeks and this next month?
Let's take a look. All right. So we still have a little bit left of August coming up. Tyler already talked on a little bit of the consumer confidence report this week that's coming out. We have GDP also coming out at the end of this week on Thursday, some more pending home sales, as well as some consumer sentiment and personal income and spending numbers that we will get on Friday. Looking a little further out into September, we've already got Labor Day coming up, end of the summertime. A few manufacturing numbers, the JOLTS data, as well as productivity and trade balance numbers that Thursday, and another employment report. And then I believe we'll be speaking before our next round of PPI and CPI data comes around to us. So see if that reflects anything in this supposed change of stance, seeing where CPI ends up, especially at that household level for those things that really affect people the most.
Yeah, that PCE report on Friday the 29th has potential to be a needle mover in that, depending on who you talk to and at what point in time, that is actually the Fed's preferred inflation gauge. So we'll see how that looks, the personal consumption expenditures, and how that impacts their conversations about what's going to go down in September when they meet.
Yeah, and then that middle of September. I know we'll meet again before then, but there's the exciting time as far
Yeah.
as the interest rate discussion. So we'll see what happens here in a few weeks. But well, everybody, as always, thank you for taking the time to join us. Again, if there are questions or topics that you would really like us to cover and address directly, we would be more than happy to do that. And if there are people in your life that are important to you that have questions that could use benefit from having a brief conversation, feel free to reach out to us through our website, srgfinancialadvisors.com, or over the phone 573-302-7212. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.